Have you ever watched a man rise without ever raising his voice? Under the searing lights of a Manhattan studio, the air wasn't just warm, it was trembling. A political panel, just another show in America's endless stream of nightly noise. But this time, something cracked. Across the table sat Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, decorated, measured, scarred by truth. Next to him, a former Trump spokesperson, sharp suit, sharper tongue. And then came the spark. Sit down, boy. 3 words that didn't just insult a man, they summoned centuries. The studio froze. America blinked. But Traoré didn't. He stood not in anger, but in something heavier. Not for applause, not for debate, but for memory. You call me boy, he said softly, but boys where I come from bury their fathers and lead villages before they turn 12. That moment, it didn't belong to the news cycle. It belonged to history. Because that night, a continent rose on live television, and America finally had to listen. Subscribe, not just for the video but for a dream, where voices like his are no longer rare. The studio was silent. No one spoke, no laughter, no coughs, not even a breath out of place. Karoline Leavitt, the woman who had just spat out the words, "Sit down, boy," leaned back, arms folded, face smug, as if she'd delivered a finishing blow. She thought she had shut him down, like many Western voices had done to African leaders before. But then, Traoré didn't sit. He didn't flip the table. He didn't shout. He didn't storm off. He stood, like a tree that had weathered too many storms to be shaken now. He stepped forward toward the edge of the stage, and then with a voice softer than silence, he began, "I come from a place where boys are forced to become men before they even learn to dream." The air tightened. No one blinked. "You can call me boy here," he said, eyes locking with Karoline's. "But where I come from, boys carry nations. They go to war so their mothers can eat. They lead because no one else will." The camera panned to an older black woman in the front row. A tear rolled down her cheek. This was no longer a debate. This was testimony. Karoline's face twitched, but the smirk was fading, and still Traoré continued. "I buried my father under the open sky," he said. "No cameras, no speeches, just dirt silence and the sound of my mother's grief." A U.S. Army veteran seated beside the panel placed his hand over his heart, unprompted instinctively. Traoré turned to him, nodding slightly. 2 soldiers, different uniforms. Same grief. Then back to Karoline. "When you say sit down, boy, do you mean the child who watched his village burn, the one who studied by candlelight because the lights never came back after colonialism packed its bags? There was no need for anger. Memory was doing the speaking, and then it happened. One clap. From the back of the room, then another, then a wave. The room didn't erupt, it rose. People stood not for pity, not even for protest, but for respect, and Karoline. She looked small, not because she shrank, but because she realized for the first time she had no idea what this man carried when he entered that room. Traoré looked down, quiet. Then up again, his voice steady, his presence electric. "You see a soldier," he said, "but I was raised by a woman who worked with bare hands. She sold firewood, walked miles in broken sandals so I could go to school. She hid her hunger, so I wouldn't feel mine." The camera cut to Karoline. The smirk was gone. She never said, "Sit down." She said, "Stand up," even when it hurts. A young black girl in the front row turned to her father and whispered, "He sounds like you." Traoré stood tall, but his eyes glistened. "So when someone like you calls me boy, you're not insulting me. You're insulting every mother who's ever carried a nation on her back." The studio was silent again, but this time it wasn't tension, it was reverence. And for the first time in years, America was listening with its heart. The applause still echoed when Karoline Leavitt shifted in her seat. She hadn't expected this. She had launched a grenade. Instead, it had shattered in her own hands. But pride dies slowly. She leaned into her mic, voice cold and sharp. Are we seriously pretending he's a saint now? Gasps rippled through the room. Traoré didn't react. He didn't need to. The studio no longer belonged to volume. It belonged to truth. Karoline pressed on, desperate now. This isn't journalism, she scoffed. This is emotional theater. The host turned to her, slow, deliberate. Then, in a move no one expected, he removed his earpiece. Karoline, he said, voice low, the cameras are rolling. You made this moment. You just didn't expect it to speak back. That line cut deeper than any insult. Karoline's lips parted, but no words came. She stood, not in triumph, in retreat. I don't need this circus, she snapped, slamming her cue cards onto the table. Her heels echoed like gunshots as she stormed off the stage. The audience didn't cheer. They didn't boo. They simply watched her vanish in silence. Then a whisper from the back row. She couldn't handle the truth. The camera returned to Traoré, still seated, still calm. I didn't come here to shame her, he said quietly. I came here to tell the truth. It was no longer a debate, it was a mirror. And America was seeing itself flawed, fractured, finally listening. The clip was already going viral. The hashtag #Traoré sit down boy had flipped now, trending with captions like, he spoke like my father never got to. This isn't just a moment, it's a reckoning. This made me cry in my kitchen. Families paused dinner. Barbershop TVs switched from sports to politics. In schools, teachers pulled up the video. Students fell silent. Then came the question from the host, Captain Traoré. Do you believe America can hear men like you? A pause. Then Traoré answered, not with anger, but with weight. Yes. But first, America has to learn to listen when it's uncomfortable. He wasn't finished. He leaned in, voice softer now, like memory speaking through flesh. Last year I visited a children's hospital in Chicago. A little girl, 8 years old, gave me a picture she drew. It had 2 flags, Burkina Faso and the United States. She said, "You're both fighting for us." The screen behind him lit up. The girl appeared live feed from her hospital bed. She waved a handmade flag and beamed, "Hi, Captain. You remembered me." Gasps filled the studio. You told me I was brave, she smiled. But tonight you were the bravest. The host covered his mouth. A mother in the 3rd row wept into her hands. Even those who came in skeptical now stood in silent awe. Traoré placed a hand over his heart. You give me strength, he said softly. You are the future I fight for. Then she said something no one expected. Next time someone says, "Sit down, boy," I'll tell them, "Stand up like Traoré." The feed ended, but the moment didn't. People rose, not in applause, but in reverence. Backstage, Karoline watched from a monitor, her hands trembling. She hadn't lost a debate, she'd lost the room. Not because Traoré shouted, but because his silence echoed louder than her scream. Question to viewers, have you ever been called something that erased your story? Comment below, enough is enough, if you've ever stood up for your dignity. The studio was still glowing with the light of a moment few had ever seen on television. A man didn't defend himself, he defended the dignity of millions. And then came the breaking point. It started with a camera operator. He set down his equipment live mid-broadcast. He walked quietly across the set. No one told him to. No one dared stop him. He reached out and shook Captain Traoré's hand. Whispered something only the microphones picked up. Thank you for reminding me what honor looks like. The host's eyes welled up. The audience had stopped being an audience. They had become witnesses. From the 3rd row, a middle-aged black woman stood. She didn't ask permission. She simply stepped forward, voice barely above a whisper. I didn't come here to speak, but I need to say this. All eyes turned. My son served in Afghanistan. He came home in a box. Her voice cracked. The room held its breath. He was called boy too, even in uniform, even in death. Gasps swept the crowd. She turned to Traoré, tears spilling. When you spoke, it felt like... My son stood up again. Traoré nodded, no words, just deep, soul-bonded acknowledgement. Even Karoline, watching from backstage, didn't interrupt, because even she could feel it. This was no longer her moment. Then came the line that split the room open. "America needs men like you, Captain, not loud mouths who talk over pain." The crowd broke, a standing ovation, not out of celebration, but release. Tears, applause, stillness. This was no longer a political panel. This was a public reckoning. Karoline's jaw clenched backstage. She whispered into her mic, "This is a setup. It's emotional theater." The host heard her through the earpiece. He removed it, turned slowly to the live camera. "Karoline, you brought this moment into the room. You just didn't expect it to speak back." Those words would later be printed in headlines. Karoline burst through the side door. She didn't care the cameras were still rolling. "I don't need this circus," she shouted, and walked off, heels like hammer strikes. But no one booed. They didn't clap either. They just watched her vanish, like a ghost who'd never belonged. And then silence again. Not empty silence, sacred silence. The kind that follows revelation. The kind that lingers after the truth has spoken. Traoré remained still. Then gently he reached into his jacket, pulled out a folded letter, creased yellowed soft at the edges, held it up to the light. "This was written by my little brother," he said, 2 days before he was killed. The audience didn't move. Killed for asking for food. He unfolded the paper slowly, reverently. He wrote, "Big brother, if I die, promise me they won't forget why." Gasps. Audible weeping. Some people held their hands over their mouths. So no, Traoré continued, "I will not sit down, because I carry the memory of those who were forced to kneel." And then, just as he folded the letter again, the screen behind him lit up. A live video feed, and there she was. The little girl from the Chicago hospital. She waved a paper flag, red, white, and green on one side, red, white, and blue on the other. "Hi, Captain," she beamed. "You remembered me." The audience melted. The host covered his mouth with a tissue. A man in the back began sobbing openly. "You said I was brave," the girl said, "but tonight, you were the bravest." Traoré's lips trembled. He placed his hand over his heart. "You give me strength," he whispered. "You are the future I fight for." Then she said something no one expected. "Next time someone says, 'Sit down, boy,' I'll tell them stand up." Like Traoré. The feed ended, but the moment carved itself into history. The room didn't clap. They rose, not as an audience, but as humans. Outside, the studio tweets exploded. "I'm in tears. My dad just called me crying. He made America listen." The hashtag, "Stand Up Like Traoré," was born. Teachers printed the transcript for classroom discussion. Clips played in churches and mosques, on buses and prisons. 1 week later, Traoré received a letter, hand-delivered, from the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis. "Dear Captain Traoré, tonight you didn't just speak for yourself. You spoke for every soul ever told, 'Sit down, boy.' We are preparing a permanent exhibition, Dignity Under Fire. We would be honored to feature your words, your story, and the moment that changed the world." He read it alone in his hotel room, then whispered, "Not for me, for all of them." Question to the audience. Has anyone ever told you to lower your voice, to sit down when you carried truth? Comment below Africa Rise if you believe dignity should never be silenced. Weeks passed. News cycles churned forward, elections, scandals, tragedies. But something remained. In that New York studio where Captain Ibrahim Traoré had once stood, a single empty chair was left on set. No plaque, no spotlight. Just there in the center. A chair no one dared move, because everyone knew what it meant. It meant dignity. It meant resistance. It meant a man had entered a room armed with nothing but truth, and walked out carrying the weight of a continent. It became a quiet shrine in a noisy world, a symbol of what television rarely dares to show: unshakable, honest humanity. The producers didn't plan for it. They didn't script it, but they didn't remove it either. That chair became sacred, and everyone from janitors to anchors walked slower past it. Some nodded. Some stopped to breathe. A few placed folded notes beneath it. One night the host returned alone. The lights were off, the audience gone, but the chair remained. He sat in the second row, whispering to no one. That chair is louder than most voices I've heard in 20 years. Then came a letter, carried by a young intern, hands shaking. Sir, this was left by Karoline Leavitt. Yes, her. The woman who had said, "Sit down, boy." No cameras this time, no audience. Just a folded piece of paper and a handwritten line. I said, "Sit down, boy." And you stood taller than I've ever seen a man stand. I was wrong. I don't expect forgiveness. But I hope my daughter grows up in a world shaped by your strength, not by my ignorance. It reached Traoré during a press conference. He paused, reading midway. Looked up at the cameras. We don't heal through silence, he said. We heal through courage. And today she showed some. It wasn't a victory speech. It was a release. Because redemption, when it arrives raw and uninvited, is not weakness. It's a whisper of growth. Later that month, Traoré was invited to speak at the United Nations. But it wasn't the speech that broke the internet. It was what he held up at the end. A small, wrinkled drawing made with crayons, an American flag. Next to it, the colors of Burkina Faso. This was given to me by a child, he said. She believed I stood for something good. That means more than any medal. Then he looked directly into the cameras. America. Don't just clap, change. In barbershops across Detroit, Atlanta, Oakland, the clip played on loop. A young boy in Accra made it his phone wallpaper. A girl in Cape Town used it in her school essay. Even a teacher in Paris asked students, what is the difference between power and presence? Outside the studio, crowds returned, not to protest, to sit silently, to leave flowers near the entrance. One man left an old army boot with a note tucked inside, for the boy who never sat down. And in the control room, a new rule was taped to the monitor. Don't interrupt truth. Let it breathe. One final moment burned itself into history. An elderly white veteran, Vietnam silver medals, trembling hands, asked to visit the studio. The producers let him in. He walked slowly, cane tapping with each step. He didn't speak. He simply stood before the empty chair, saluted, then whispered, "That man showed more courage in 5 minutes than I saw in 5 years of war." And quietly, he placed his medals on the seat, turned, and walked out. No music, no speech, just truth leaving the room on its own feet. And now that chair sits still, unclaimed, unchanged, but no longer empty, because every time someone watches that clip, every time a child hears the words, "Stand up like Traoré," that chair is filled again. In a world flooded with noise where outrage is currency and speed replaces depth, one man from Burkina Faso made America go silent. Not with fury, not with force, but with memory, dignity, and truth. We watched a man who didn't yell, but made millions cry. We saw an 8-year-old girl with 2 drawn flags remind 2 nations that hope needs no passport. We heard a black mother, her son lost in war, say that Traoré's voice brought him back for a moment. And then we saw a single empty chair, no label, no script. Because everyone knew that's where truth once sat. This wasn't just a moment on television. It was a moment of reckoning. A reminder that when someone speaks from the grave of history, with nothing but pain and clarity, the world must listen. When Karoline Leavitt said, "Sit down, boy," she thought she ended a debate, but she didn't realize she woke up a continent. Traoré didn't rise to retaliate. He rose for every child who never made it to school, for every mother who sold firewood to feed someone else's dream, for every brother who wrote, "If I die, promise me." They won't forget why. And we haven't forgotten. Africa doesn't need pity. Africa needs to be heard with the full weight of respect. And if you're still reading this, then know, you weren't just watching, you were witnessing, Drop a comment, New Africa, if you believe a new generation of Africans is rising stronger, bolder, no longer silent. And one last thing, don't just scroll past this story, share it, repeat it, let it echo, because somewhere there's still a boy with his head down. And maybe he just needs one voice to whisper, don't sit down. Stand up like Traoré. In an age where media thrives on outrage and conflict, and where the loudest voices often drown out the most truthful ones, Captain Ibrahim Traoré delivered a lesson not just in words, but in presence. His confrontation with a Western commentator did not involve shouting or accusations. Instead, he stood still, anchored in history, memory, and pain, and spoke a truth that shook the walls of a New York studio and echoed across continents. From that moment, we did not simply witness a man respond to insult. We witnessed a continent rise. The lesson begins with the context. A young African leader, deeply scarred by colonial legacy, enters an American studio not to debate, but to speak truth. When a political commentator spits the phrase, "Sit down, boy," she does not realize she's not just addressing a man. She's addressing centuries of struggle, of erasure, of forced silence. But Traoré doesn't shout back. He rises not with rage, but with the silent weight of history and says, "You call me boy, but boys, where I come from, bury their fathers and lead villages before they turn 12. That sentence, quiet yet thunderous, taught the world a critical lesson. Dignity is not volume. Dignity is presence. It is the refusal to be reduced. In that moment, every African who has ever been dismissed, stereotyped, or silenced felt seen. Traoré was not defending himself. He was standing in for every mother who worked barefoot for her child's future, for every father who died without justice, for every child whose potential was stolen by war or neglect. And the studio froze not from fear, but from recognition. The power of that moment came not from performance, but from testimony. Traoré's words did not seek sympathy. They demanded respect. When he said, "You're not insulting me. You're insulting every mother who's ever carried a nation on her back," he reframed the insult from the personal to the historical. That is a critical lesson for any people who have been marginalized. Reclaiming the narrative is not about proving worth to oppressors. It's about reminding the world that your story matters. The reaction was telling. A tear from an old black woman in the crowd, a salute from a U.S. veteran, silence from those who usually dominate airspace with opinions. For once, the media did not interrupt the truth. They let it breathe. And that is another lesson: truth doesn't need to shout. When it comes wrapped in pain and dignity, it is louder than any scream. From an African perspective, this moment was transformative. The Western world has long spoken about Africa, often in condescension, sometimes in pity, rarely in respect. But Traoré's voice shifted the lens. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he embodied the trauma and triumph of an entire continent. His presence made clear that Africa does not need permission to speak. It only needs space, and when given its voice, can change the room. The story did not end with applause. It continued in classrooms, where teachers printed the transcript in churches, where the clip was replayed in homes, where families cried together. It reached children in Burkina Faso and Chicago alike. It crossed borders, languages, and politics. That is the true power of testimony. It travels further than policy, further than debate. It becomes cultural memory. The most profound lesson, perhaps, was delivered not by Traoré himself, but by a young girl in a hospital bed who had drawn two flags, Burkina Faso and the United States. She said, "Next time someone says, 'Sit down, boy,' I'll tell them, stand up like Traoré." In her voice, we saw the future one, where dignity is not defined by race, nationality, or volume, but by courage, truth, and memory. This moment also taught us something about redemption. Karoline Leavitt, the woman who uttered the insult later, sent a handwritten note admitting she was wrong. "I don't expect forgiveness," she wrote, "but I hope my daughter grows up in a world shaped by your strength, not by my ignorance." That is a rare form of public humility. And it reminds us healing is possible, but it starts with the acknowledgement of harm. For Africans and for all marginalized peoples, this story offers a roadmap. You do not need to conform to Western expectations of professionalism or aggression to be heard. You need only to tell your truth with clarity, with courage, and with calm. When you do, the world must adjust its volume to hear you. That is how you reclaim space. That is how you resist silence. One final image lingers: the empty chair left in the studio untouched, sacred. It was not labeled or spotlit, but everyone knew it marked where truth once sat. That chair is a symbol of what happens when history is not buried, but spoken. It is a shrine to memory, to resilience, to presence. In the end, the lesson is this: dignity cannot be taken. It can only be surrendered, and Traoré refused to surrender. Resistance does not always look like rebellion. Sometimes it looks like a man standing still while the world tries to erase him. And memory is not weakness, it is strength. Because when a people remember who they are, no insult, no empire, no erasure can make them sit down again. So stand up like Traoré. As an African, watching Captain Ibrahim Traoré stand in that American studio was more than just witnessing a viral clip. It was witnessing justice long delayed finding its moment. It was the sound of centuries pushing through a man's throat, not to scream, not to beg, but to speak softly yet unshakably for all of us. That night, he did not just represent Burkina Faso. He became the living memory of the African experience, scarred, silenced, but never broken. Growing up on this continent, we've all heard the stories. Our grandmothers walked barefoot to fetch water before school. Our uncles were called boy in their own land. Our fathers were sent to fight wars that were never ours, only to return to empty promises. We've buried brothers, cousins, friends, victims of poverty, of politics, of systems that saw us as statistics. And yet we keep rising. But rarely, if ever, are our voices truly heard outside our soil. That is why this moment mattered. Not just because Traoré was eloquent, not because he wore a uniform, but because he carried our dignity with him into a space where African dignity is so often crushed or mocked. He did not raise his voice, he raised our story. When Karoline Leavitt told him to sit down, boy, it wasn't just a racist insult, it was a reenactment of colonialism. That phrase had been hurled at us before, across centuries, by governors, by generals, by plantation owners, by diplomats. It was always meant to remind us of our place beneath. But this time, something ancient stirred. Traoré didn't sit. He stood, and in doing so, he made millions of us stand with him, even from afar. His words struck with precision. You call me boy, but boys, where I come from, bury their fathers and lead villages before they turn 12. As an African, I felt that in my bones. I have seen it in my neighborhood. I have seen young boys carry the weight of men. I have seen daughters become mothers to their siblings because their parents were taken by war, by hunger, by indifference. What Traoré said in that studio wasn't just a reply, it was a mirror. A mirror for America, but also a mirror for Africa to see ourselves not as victims, but as survivors. To remember that our pain has purpose, that our stories matter, that our silence forced for generations is beginning to break. The reactions in the studio said everything. A tear from a black woman in the audience, a salute from a U.S. veteran, silence from a room used to noise, and later a standing ovation not for spectacle, but for truth. In that space, for once, an African was not the object of a debate, but the author of the moment. And from here in Africa, we saw it all. We saw how trauma doesn't need translation, how the pain of colonization, the betrayal of allies, and the theft of futures could be felt across oceans. We saw how a quiet voice, when armed with truth, could command a room louder than any army. The little girl from Chicago who drew 2 flags and called Traoré brave reminded us of what we fight for. Not for revenge, not for pity, but for the right to be human fully unapologetically. Her words stand up like Traore have already become a mantra here. I've seen them on murals in Ouagadougou, in WhatsApp, statuses in Lagos, and protest chants in Kinshasa. He has become not just a man, but a metaphor. For Africans, especially our youth, this was a turning point. Too often we're told to lower our voice, to accept the terms of the world as written by others. But now we know we don't need to fit into someone else's story. We are enough. Our pain is valid. Our voice is rising. Even the backlash was revealing. When Karoline Leavitt called the moment emotional theater, it was the last defense of a system losing control. Her words revealed a truth: the West is not used to listening to Africans unless we conform, unless we entertain, unless we echo their worldview. But Traoré didn't conform. He didn't entertain. He confronted politely, powerfully, and that's why it worked. The final image of the empty chair, left untouched in the studio, resonated deeply here. It reminded us of the many chairs left vacant across Africa, chairs our leaders never returned to after exile, chairs our fathers never came home to after laboring in foreign lands, chairs our brothers left behind after they drowned, seeking opportunity. But this chair was different. It was not a chair of loss, it was a chair of memory, a reminder that we too belong in the room, that our truth deserves a seat. Then came the letter from Karoline. No cameras, no excuses, just a note admitting she was wrong. That too was a lesson: it is never too late to listen, to learn, to begin anew. For too long, reconciliation between Africa and the West has been cosmetic. But real healing begins when truth is acknowledged, when harm is named, when people like Karoline realize they've been speaking over us, not to us. I write this now not just as an African, but as a witness. Because we have always known our worth, we just needed the world to see it. And through Traoré they did. This wasn't just a man refusing to be silenced. It was Africa refusing invisibility. It was history demanding recognition. And now every African child who sees that clip knows you do not need to yell to be heard. You do not need to beg to be respected. You need only to stand in your truth, and the world will shift. So from Accra to Algiers, from Dakar to Dar es Salaam, we say this: we will not sit down. We will not forget. We will not be erased. We will stand like Traoré. And the world must now decide, will it listen, or will it lose its chance to grow? Because Africa is not waiting anymore. Africa is rising with memory as its compass and dignity as its fire. We must also remember that what Traoré represented in that moment was not just personal dignity, it was political power of a new kind. A kind that no longer asks for permission to exist on the global stage. A kind that comes not from weapons or wealth, but from an unwavering sense of identity. When he said, "I carry the memory of those who were forced to kneel," he reminded us that leadership in Africa is no longer about titles, it's about truth. And truth once spoken with clarity cannot be undone. Here in Africa, we have long been told to be grateful for crumbs, grateful for aid with strings, grateful for loans that poison our economies, grateful for visits from Western leaders who still see us as footnotes to their foreign policy. But Traoré's moment was not just defiance, it was redefinition. It was the declaration that we are no longer in the age of dependency. We are in the age of dignity, and this shift cannot be reversed. Across the continent, something has begun to awaken. Not in government palaces, but in the hearts of ordinary people. Market women in Bamako, young poets in Johannesburg, miners in Lubumbashi, fishermen in Dakar, students in Addis Ababa. They all watched this moment unfold and saw themselves not as distant observers, but as participants in a shared uprising of spirit. Because Traoré did what many of our own leaders have failed to do, he told the truth, even when it was inconvenient. And perhaps this is the most painful part: the contrast. While many African leaders attend summits in Europe where they're spoken down to like children, Traoré brought Europe and America to silence. While others chase validation, he demanded respect. While some still wear colonial chains in their minds, he broke them with a whisper. His presence exposed the hollowness of so many of our so-called leaders who would rather shake hands than speak boldly. But the lesson is not just for leaders. It's for every African who has ever felt small, who has ever been told their story didn't matter, who has ever doubted their place in the world. Traoré reminded us that we do not need to become like the West to be great. We do not need to apologize for our pain or sanitize our history to make others comfortable. Our truth is powerful in its rawness, and the world is beginning to see it too. Teachers are using his speech in classrooms, not just in Africa, but in Europe and America. Civil rights museums are preserving his words. Young children are drawing his face beside their national flags. This is not propaganda. This is awakening. This is what happens when memory becomes action, when pain becomes poetry, when silence becomes thunder. So let them remember, Africa is not behind. Africa is not broken. Africa is not begging. Africa is becoming. And when they try again to say, "Sit down, boy," we will answer, "We have already stood, and we are not sitting down again." A tear from a black woman in the audience. A salute from a U.S. veteran. Silence from a room used to noise. And later a standing ovation not for spectacle, but for truth. In that space for once, an African was not the object of a debate, but the author of the moment. And from here in Africa, we saw it all. We saw how trauma doesn't need translation, how the pain of colonization, the betrayal of allies, and the theft of futures could be felt across oceans. We saw how a quiet voice, when armed with truth, could command a room louder than any army. The little girl from Chicago who drew 2 flags and called Traoré brave reminded us of what we fight for. Not for revenge, not for pity, but for the right to be human fully unapologetically. Her words stand up like Traoré have already become a mantra here. I've seen them on murals in Ouagadougou, in WhatsApp, statuses in Lagos, and protest chants in Kinshasa. He has become not just a man, but a metaphor. For Africans, especially our youth, this was a turning point. Too often we're told to lower our voice, to accept the terms of the world as written by others. But now we know we don't need to fit into someone else's story. We are enough. Our pain is valid. Our voice is rising. Even the backlash was revealing. When Karoline Leavitt called the moment emotional theater, it was the last defense of a system losing control. Her words revealed a truth. The West is not used to listening to Africans unless we conform, unless we entertain, unless we echo their worldview. But Traoré didn't conform. He didn't entertain. He confronted politely, powerfully, and that's why it worked. The final image of the empty chair, left untouched in the studio, resonated deeply here. It reminded us of the many chairs left vacant across Africa, chairs our leaders never returned to after exile, chairs our fathers never came home to after laboring in foreign lands, chairs our brothers left behind after they drowned, seeking opportunity. But this chair was different. It was not a chair of loss, it was a chair of memory, a reminder that we too belong in the room, that our truth deserves a seat. Then came the letter from Karoline. No cameras, no excuses, just a note admitting she was wrong. That too was a lesson. It is never too late to listen, to learn, to begin anew. For too long, reconciliation between Africa